He's this British writer that I absolutely love. I would really recommend his books to you. I think definitely buy them. You don't have to read them, but buy as many as possible. Buy up any you can find. That's my advice. Yeah, I never had a strong feeling that I wanted to be anything in particular. You know, people say I wanted to be a fireman or I wanted to drive a train. I never had any of those feelings. I never had a vocation particularly. I was always interested in writing. I always loved books. I loved reading from quite a young age. And I always had a vague sense I'd quite like to write myself. I read a huge amount of fantasy books as a kid, and I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy role-playing games. And so I had a lot of ideas buzzing around my head. I liked the task of writing. You know, I enjoyed doing it. But I never thought I'd be a writer. That was never some kind of big game plan. I ended up working as a video editor, a TV editor, in my 20s. And that job gave me a lot of time off. I was freelance, and in between jobs, I'd have a week here, a couple of weeks there where I wasn't busy. And so I felt like I needed a project to really get my teeth into. And I ended up thinking I'll write my take on a fantasy trilogy. And that's really where the serious writing began. I just started to get very interested in what came out for some reason. And so there was no big game plan at all. It's just where I've ended up, I guess. So when I was about 20, just after I'd finished university, I did a psychology degree, so I had no skills really. And I felt like I needed to have a skill to get into the workplace. And so I thought I'll learn to touch type. And in order to learn to type, I would write a novel. And so that was really the first effort I had. And it came out very pompous, very cliche, classic fantasy stuff. And I quite quickly got bored of it and stopped doing it. And then many years later, or maybe 10 years later, when I was working as an editor, as I say, I tried again to write this story, and it just had straight away a very different tone. More world-weary, more wry, more tongue-in-cheek, more of a sense of humour, really. And straight away, I just became interested in what was coming out. And so I just got fascinated by how you create a scene, you know, what you focus on, when you use thought, when you use dialogue. Because when you describe a room, there are a million different details you could pick out. So what do you pick out? Why? How do you pace a scene? How much do you describe? How much do you hold back? I just got very interested in the craft of writing, I suppose, and how to construct scenes. And I maybe spent 6 months writing 5 or 6 chapters, just picking over them, revising them, going over and over, developing the voices of the characters as well. And by the end of that 6-month period, I felt as though writing was something I was always going to do, even if I never really got published. I just was fascinated by it and enjoyed doing it, really. Well, I think what makes this book different is that what started as quite a medieval or Renaissance fantasy world, quite a familiar fantasy world in a sense, has developed quite a lot by this point. So we're now at the early Industrial Revolution. We have the children of characters that we're familiar with, but we're moving into a very different age, an age of money, of industry, of invention. And these upheavals create all kinds of change and conflict for the characters that are at the center of the story. So I think for me, it's a much more interesting and original setting for a fantasy story than certainly I've worked with before. So it's all about change, progress, and I think there's a lot there that's relevant to the modern world too, I hope. Yeah, I entirely agree. I think the fantasy I read as a kid often had these medieval worlds that felt like they'd been unchanged for thousands of years, and that conflict within them had to be the result of a kind of manufactured good and evil in a way that didn't really make any real sense from the motivations of the people involved. I wanted my world to feel like it was endlessly changing and developing, and that conflict came naturally out of these great tectonic upheavals of economics and politics and power, change and progress constantly placing stress on people's lives. And so I'm always fascinated by these times of great change in society. The previous books often looked at the kind of rise of the merchant class and the importance of money, really. And these books are much more about the coming of the machine and the change of society that comes as a result of that.
Ronda rápida de preguntas típicas.
I couldn't say, I'm sure that's different for everyone. No, it's one sentence. Neither. No, I think both. Neither, both. A good balance between planning and creativity. There needs to be some looseness, some joy in the writing. I've never not written something in order not to offend, but I've certainly changed my mind about whether things work or not. And I'm a big editor. I rewrite and re-edit things constantly to try and make them better, have more impact. But I guess I'd rather offend more than less. Well, I don't know that I was necessarily imitating Star Wars in any significant sense. I'd love to imitate the success of Star Wars, certainly, commercially. I guess the good thing about 30 years is it's a generational gap, you know, and that's perhaps part of the reason for it. The characters you're familiar with from the previous installment become the older generation, the parents, the mentors of your new, younger set of characters. And that's very much what's happened in the case of these books. In the new books, there's a new generation. Many of them are children of, you know, characters we know from previous books, or they're kind of that generation. And I think that's a natural kind of gap to take. Yeah, I think I was very interested in the parent-child dynamic in these books. It's one that wasn't necessarily present in the first set of books I wrote. The characters in the first trilogy were very much outsiders, often kind of used up people who were exiles from their own societies in many ways, who were cut free of moorings, didn't have parents, had lost their parents one way or another. This new trilogy, very much the central characters are in the shadows of their parents, so certainly in this first book anyway. And so there was definitely that dynamic. I think perhaps, you know, I've had kids myself and become a parent since I first started writing, so maybe that parent-child dynamic is very much on my mind. Maybe I sympathise more with the parents than I did before. Yeah, I think even if we're writing about the past in some ways, with the trappings of the past, fantasy often puts characters with a very modern way of looking at the world into that, you know, historical setting, if you like. Historical fiction is where people really try and look at the past precisely. Fantasy is much more about holding a mirror up to the present, or at least the more interesting fantasy is for me. And so I never want to avoid some kind of comment or look at those issues which are important to modern people. We're all modern writers writing for modern audiences in the end. And so whatever is particularly occupying our thoughts in the world, in politics at the time, naturally comes out onto the pages of what you're writing. At the same time, I think it's important not to become, you know, a kind of very lightly disguised message fiction. You know, I want to tackle some of these issues and look at how they might impact on the lives of the people. But first of all, I want to write an engaging story with fascinating people. That's really always the first port of call. Yeah, well, clearly that's been a major issue for anyone in Britain or indeed Europe for the past few years. So certainly it's come up. And I think the rise of populism generally is something that I certainly look at in these books. The nature of popular movements, the damage they can potentially do, whether they're a force for good or evil. It's impossible to avoid, I think, being influenced by such big events that are going on around us. I think for a long time, there's been this sense the modern world was becoming more rational, more evidence-led, more scientific, with some exceptions, but generally the movement was in that direction, towards a kind of sensible, perhaps even quite a boring middle ground of politics. It feels like the last few years have seen a massive reversal in that trend, a reaction against that trend, if you like, where the extremes have suddenly become vastly more popular and appealing. And the appeal is much less to evidence and rationality than it is to kind of emotion and mob mentality to a degree. So that certainly finds itself expressed in this series of books. I think there's certainly a degree to which human nature is universal, you know, and we can see ourselves reflected in the past and in fantasy worlds for sure. I'm quite cynical in my approach to fantasy. I think fantasy fiction is often quite shiny, quite heroic, features heroes with very positive, noble aspirations. And in contrast to that, I like people who are quite ruthless, quite selfish, to look at the other side of the coin, if you like. So I think there's always a certain degree of ambition and greed that's present in human nature. And I like to look at that side of things. Sex. Yeah, I mean, I think the approach to fantasy generally was to look at a genre where things are often quite shiny, quite romanticized, quite simplified, and to take a much more gritty, honest look, and that was the approach with the violence. I wanted to make the violence lacking in any honor or glory. I wanted it to be filthy and unpleasant, show how destructive it was for both the perpetrators and the victim. And it felt as though the approach to sex should be similar to the approach to violence, that there should be an honesty throughout. And so the idea is just to take a very unromantic attitude to it as much as anything. And also always to surprise people and show people a side of things they're perhaps not used to seeing. So really, I think rather than it being some particular attempt to show gritty and unpleasant sex, it's just an attempt to make the sex mirror the rest of the things that happen in the story, just show it as a facet of human existence like any other. Every writer has their own process and their own way of achieving the result. And it's very hard to separate that process from the outcome, if you like. So it's very hard to say, wouldn't it be great if Martin wrote a book every year? Because that's just not what he does. And you wouldn't have the books you have if that was his process. You can only ever get a Martin book from Martin. So sadly, if you have to wait, you just have to wait. I mean, looking at my own personal way of approaching writing, I try to take any magic and romanticism out of it and look at it as work, and make steady progress as much as I possibly can. And I'm quite organized and planned, I suppose. So in the case of this trilogy, I felt it was very important to finish the whole thing, or to write a rough draft at least of all 3 books, so I could really know what the end was going to be before I started working on the front. There's a pressure always in publishing to get the next book out as soon as you possibly can. And that can sometimes, work against you if you're working on a series, because you put a book out and then you think, wouldn't it be wonderful if I'd have just changed this character, or if I could make this event take place in a different way. So I wanted to write all 3 together. And I felt commercially it meant that the publication could be planned as well as possible. It could be done at the right time of year. It could be done in the way that suited the books best rather than just rushed out as quickly as possible. So that just felt like the best way to work from that point of view. And luckily, my publishers kind of gave me the grace and the time to do that, which meant a break of 2 or 3 years between publishing, but hopefully will mean regular and relatively quick publishing for these 3 books now. The 3rd book's not totally revised and edited, so there's still time to change some things there. But writing's like cement, I find. When you first pour it, you can mash it around all over the place, but quite quickly it starts to harden. And after a while, even making tiny changes becomes almost impossible. So you naturally reach a point where you just have to let it go.